Hi, my name is Gloria, and recently I went through something pretty traumatic. Unlike most of you, I never found a place that I can call home. You see, I'm originally from Mexico, but last year I immigrated to the USA. Throughout my childhood, everyone always talked about the American dream. So when my dad told us we'd be moving there, I wasn't surprised. But what happened next turned my family's life upside down. I still get shivers thinking about it today, and I need to be honest with you guys. I wish we'd never moved. Truly, it was the biggest mistake of our life. Part of me was a tiny bit curious about moving to the USA, but I didn't want to leave Mexico. Our life was simple, and I liked it that way. My dad, however, always talked about the lack of opportunities for us in Mexico and how we could have a much better life if we immigrated. His best friend Juan moved a few years ago, and he made out as if living in the USA was the best thing ever. For Juan and his family, it had been such a smooth process. They had obtained their visas easily, found a nice enough apartment, and landed good jobs and places in a great school. It seems so simple, right? And he promised my dad it'd be the same for us. That once we got there, we'd live happily ever after like them. Well, if only. Dad decided he would go first and stay with Juan until he sorted things out for us. His visa was surprisingly quick to come through, and before we knew it, he was on his way. We dropped him off at the border with only a suitcase of clothes and said we'd see him soon. Mom was pretty emotional as this would be the first time they'd been separated since they'd met. There were a lot of tears, and I remember thinking, chill out, Mom. I mean, we'd be there in like a month. Why all the tears? It's almost like she had a premonition of what was going to happen. Later that day, we got a call from Dad, and everything had gone well. He was at Juan's place, and he said he'd start looking for a job immediately, and that we should begin the visa process. He urged us to use the agency he'd used, as they had a few guys on the inside that could hustle the visas along. So that's what we did. We used an agency, and they promised us the visas would be ready within a month. After a month passed, we still didn't have our visas. We were worried something had gone wrong. I felt this deep sense of dread, but also a kind of peace. Maybe it wasn't meant to be. During our month of waiting, Dad landed 2 jobs. One was stacking shelves with Juan in a supermarket, and the other was as a taxi driver. So he was pretty much working 24/7. I mean, would we even see him? We eventually got our visas. Turns out they'd messed up our names and had to redo them all. We headed towards the border, and it was like deja vu, except this time, we were the ones crossing. I crossed first and had no problems. They asked me a few questions like where would I be living, what school would I be going to, etc. But otherwise, it was super chilled and I felt so relieved. I mean, you always hear these horror stories of immigration officials interrogating people. Pedro was up next, and it was smooth sailing for him too. They didn't ask him any questions because his English is pretty much non-existent. He was only 7 years old then, so you can't blame him. Then it was Mom's turn. It looked like everything was going well. It almost looked like the immigration official was flirting with Mom. I saw her laughing, but then something else happened. Suddenly, she wasn't laughing. She wasn't even smiling. 2 security guards came over and one was on the phone. The next moment was a complete blur as I saw Mom break down into tears and get escorted away. I started screaming for her. She tried to turn around, but the guards were marching her towards the interrogation room. I could hear her wailing, and I honestly had no idea what to do. I tried to get back through immigration to the Mexican side, but we were stuck in no man's land. They wouldn't let us through. I was shouting my mom's name until I almost lost my voice. An hour passed, and Pedro and I were inconsolable. We knew our dad was waiting just on the other side, and he'd be worried about us. Eventually, a female immigration officer came over to us and told us something that was about to change our lives forever. Sorry, kids, but your mom won't be getting into the USA anytime soon, I'm afraid. She committed a bad crime a few years back, and so whoever issued her visa did it illegally. There's a huge black mark on her name. Sorry to break the news to you like this, but let's get you onto the other side, shall we? I hear your dad is waiting for you. As she said all of this, tears started streaming down my face. I thought I would throw up. How could my mom be a criminal? Surely it was some kind of mistake. My mom is a nurse. She wouldn't hurt a fly. I told the woman we weren't going anywhere, but she looked me directly in the eyes and told me we didn't have a choice. and then she said something that made me want to hurt her. I advise you to cooperate here, girl. You don't want to turn out like your mom, do you? Anger was pulsing through me, and suddenly all I wanted was to see my dad. Did he know about what Mom had done? What had she done? We made it through to the American side, and if I never had to see those immigration officials again in my life, I'd be forever grateful. Both Pedro and I ran into Dad's arms, and he could instantly tell something had happened. "Where's your mom?" he said. I couldn't even speak, and he knew. His face crumbled. I'd never seen him look so broken as he did at that moment. The taxi ride back to our new life was miserable. None of us spoke. You could have pierced the silence with a needle. It was honestly horrible. Our life as we'd known it was over. That first day, I didn't even notice how run down our neighborhood was, or the fact that all we had was one mattress on the floor to sleep on. It's not like we could sleep anyway. Juan and his wife rushed over and tried to put us in touch with some lawyers, but it seemed hopeless. It all felt too raw for me to even ask Dad what Mom had done. But in bed that night, he finally told me. Before we were born, Mom had been involved in a hit-and-run accident. She had been working a night shift at the hospital and had hit a young guy who was walking in the road. She hadn't noticed and had continued on home. But then she noticed a bit of blood on her car and suddenly realized what had happened. They'd thought this was all in the past and that it would have been wiped off her record by now because the young guy had survived and had eventually dropped the charges. But clearly, this was still haunting them. At first, I felt angry. Why hadn't my mom stopped to help? That seemed so unlike her. But then things started to make sense, like why she was so jittery and nervous when we were driving on certain roads. I felt so bad for her. An accident that was actually a crime was now creeping back up and destroying her life, and our lives too? Life just felt so unfair. What would we do? Dad said she'd never get through the border now. There was no way. That night, we all cried ourselves to sleep and hoped the morning would bring some good news. But it didn't. Things just got worse. In the daylight, I noticed how dirty our new place was, and how noisy. I told Dad we should just go home and be with Mom. She needed us. But he refused. He said we'd find a way to get her here, and in the meantime, we had to start school and make a new life for ourselves. Easier said than done, though. I'm not lying when I say the next year flew by. It flew by in a blur of lawyer appointments, homework, and slowly trying to rebuild our life without Mom. Mom, of course, was back in the village with all our family and back in her old job, but she was heartbroken. We all were. I barely made any friends that first year. I just focused on getting good grades so that this whole immigration move wouldn't have been for nothing. Pedro adapted pretty quickly, and soon his English was almost as good as mine. Dad worked really hard all year so that he could rent us a nicer house to live in, something with a small garden. And when we eventually did move into that house, things did get better. I think I grew used to being the motherly figure in the house, and we were still so determined to get Mom into the USA. Dad was working tirelessly with a lawyer, but so far they hadn't been successful. Honestly, some days I wanted to just give up and go back home where we belonged. One day we got a call from the lawyer. He'd found a potential loophole that might work. Dad rushed home from his supermarket shift, and we decided to have celebratory dinner. I cooked for us all, and for the first time in a year, it felt like we were finally happy. I went to wash up, and that's when I heard a crashing sound. It sounded like glass smashing. I ran through to the lounge and found Dad with his head in his hands. I didn't understand what had happened, but then I looked through the window just in time to see a gang of boys driving off with this taxi. They'd robbed us. We called the police, but there was nothing they could do. It felt like for every one step forward, we took two backward. Dad was devastated. At that moment, I realized this wasn't working. We were just living in this huge bubble of uncertainty and pretending that everything was okay. All we wanted more than anything was to be reunited with Mom, and the only way to make this happen was to move home. After everything my dad had done to make this work, we realized it was hopeless. And now that he'd just had his taxi stolen, we took this as a sign that it was time to go home. And you know what? I don't regret it for a second. I mean, we tried, we really did. But living without mom just isn't a life we want to live. Now we're back in Mexico, and our American dream seems like a distant nightmare. What do you think of my story? Please leave your comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel.